All right, class, so here's chapter 6 on the muscular system. Here's the outline of what we're looking at with muscles. First of all muscles are excitable, meaning they respond to stimuli and nervous intervention. They're contractile, means they can shorten. They're extensible, means they can stretch. And they're elastic, which means they can return to their original length after being shortened or stretched. There's 3 types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscles are the voluntary muscles which we control. They're responsible for the things listing there that you should read through and know. The body has more than 600 skeletal muscles. Some muscles are synergistic, which means they must contract at the same time to cause movement. And some are what we call antagonistic, where the movement is produced when one muscle of the pair contracts and the other relaxes. An example of an antagonistic pair are your bicep muscle and your tricep muscle. So your bicep is on the front side of your upper arm, the triceps is on the back, and the biceps will contract and flex your arm when the triceps relaxes. So here's a look at your biceps contracting while the triceps relaxes as you flex your forearm. In order to extend your forearm and move it down, the tricep will contract and the biceps will relax. So here are more than the 600 muscles. It's fun to see this picture. A lot of them are the same on the right as the left side of the body. And you can see there's many muscles in the face for facial expression. You can see here the muscles in the chest, the abdomen, in the legs, and also the arms. Most of the major muscles we use for locomotion, manipulation, and other voluntary movements that are attached to bone. A tendon is a band of connective tissue that attaches a muscle to a bone, and the origin of a muscle is the end attached to the bone that remains relatively stationary during the movement, and the insertion of a muscle is the end that attaches to the bone that actually moves the bone. Tendinitis, whenever you see the word itis, that means inflammation. This is a condition of having an inflamed tendon. It's usually caused by overuse, misuse, or age. And healing is slow because tendons have poor blood supply, so they can't get the oxygen they need to rebuild. And the most effective treatment for tendinitis is just rest. A muscle pull, also called a muscle strain or tear, is caused by overstretching. That damages the muscle or tendon, and treatment includes ice to reduce swelling and keeping the muscle stretched. Text neck can be what we call a stiff neck, caused by damage from hunching over a mobile device while texting. It can be avoided by taking breaks, sitting more upright, and rotating your shoulders. An entire intact muscle is formed from individual muscle fibers that are wrapped in groups and increasingly larger bundles. And each is wrapped in a connective tissue sheath or piece of tissue. A fascicle is what we call a bundle of muscle cells, and a skeletal muscle can have many fascicle bundles within it. Each fascicle is connected by its own connective sheath, and this connective sheath of fascicles merge at the end of muscles to form tendons. A muscle cell is another word for that we call muscle fiber. And when skeletal muscle cells are viewed under a microscope, we can see their distinct bands of striations formed by the arrangement of myofibrils within the cell. And myofibrils are specialized bundles of proteins, and each myofibril contains 2 types of myofilaments. They're either myosin, which are thick filaments, or actin, which are thin filaments. Each myofibril has tens of thousands of contractile or shortening units called sarcomeres, and they're connected with each other from Z-line to Z-line, which is a dark band you can see. One end of each actin is attached to the Z-line, and myosin filaments lie in the middle of the sarcomere. Their ends partially overlap with the surrounding actin, and the degree of overlap increases when the muscle contracts or shortens. So here's a look at a section of skeletal muscle. You can see how skeletal muscle consists of many bundles of muscle cells. These are called fascicles. And each bundle is called a fascicle, and a muscle cell, if we take one out, consists of many myofibrils. Here are the striped appearations of the stripes or striated appearance of a skeletal muscle cell. And this is showing a light micrograph of a longitudinal view of a skeletal muscle cell. And if we look down here at one sarcomere, which is one contractile unit of muscle, we see how this dark band is the Z disc. And in between the dark bands, we have the thinner actin myofilaments and the thinner actin myofilaments and the thicker myosin myofilaments. Muscle contraction occurs at a molecular, a teeny tiny level. According to this sliding filament model, a muscle contracts when actin filaments will slide past their myosin and shortens the sarcomere. The myosin molecules are shaped like a two-headed golf club, and the club-shaped myosin heads are key to actually moving or pulling the actin filaments by them. The myosin head, known as a cross bridge, attaches to a nearby actin filament. The head will bend and swivel and pulls the actin filament towards the midline of the sarcomere. And then the myosin head will disengage from that actin filament. The movements of myosin always require energy and ATP before the cycle can begin again. So here's a look at the actin and myosin and how during muscle contraction, they're slid past each other so the sarcomere will actually shorten. Muscle contraction is controlled by the availability of calcium ions. So we talked about calcium and what controls its levels in the blood in the hormones in chapter 5. Muscle cells contain the proteins troponin and tropomyosin, and when they make a complex, calcium ions will regulate muscle contraction and act at the site where actin and myosin bind together. When a muscle is relaxed, the troponin tropomyosin complex covers the actin myosin binding sites, so they're unable to connect to each other. But muscle contraction occurs when calcium ions will bind to troponin, allowing for those binding sites to become exposed so that actin and myosin can come together and form a cross bridge and then contract and shorten the muscle. So here's a look a little bit at the molecular level, what happens. In a resting sarcomere, we have this troponin and tropomyosin complex, which is this little red bead and then kind of this spring of spaghetti, covering all of these binding sites where the myosin head would normally want to attach. Calcium, when calcium binds to troponin, it actually will move this complex of tropomyosin off of the binding sites. And when that happens, the myosin can reach up and touch the actin and pull and slide the actin past each other for contraction. Calcium ions are stored in what we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Transverse tubules are pockets in the plasma membrane. They will carry the signal of a motor nerve cell deep into the muscle cell to every sarcomere. Rigor mortis is muscle contraction that occurs at death. So muscle contraction will occur as long as ATP is present. And without ATP, the cross bridge cannot be broken, which means the myosin will continue to be connected to actin, keeping the muscle contracted. Within 3 to 4 hours after death, the muscles will become stiff, and we call this rigor mortis because there's not ATP present, energy, to break that connection between actin and myosin. Actin and myosin will gradually break down and the muscles will relax again after 2 to 3 days. The neuromuscular junction is the space or junction between the tip of a motor neuron and a skeletal muscle cell. A nerve impulse will travel down a motor neuron to the neuromuscular junction, where it will release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine from the motor neuron. Acetylcholine will travel or diffuse across the small gap, bind to receptors on the plasma membrane of the muscle cell, and it's acetylcholine that causes changes in the muscle cell, resulting in an electrochemical message similar to a nerve impulse that then gets sent along the plasma membrane of the muscle cell into your T tubules and then into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And this message is what tells the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium ions for muscle contraction. And this is a great video showing contraction of muscles. I encourage you to watch it at your own time under the PowerPoint file in the modules. And then just a review of what happens at that neuromuscular junction, how acetylcholine is released, binds to receptors on the muscle cell, changing it to an electrochemical message, which then gets sent. It's shown as black arrows down the T tubules into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, basically telling your calcium ions to be released because calcium is what we need for muscle contraction. Muscular dystrophy is a group of inherited conditions in which muscles weaken. If too many calcium ions enter a muscle cell, proteins can be destroyed, eventually causing the muscle cell to die on a large scale, causing muscle weakness. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is one of the most common forms. The gene for production of the protein dystrophin is defective, and lack of dystrophin allows excess calcium ions to enter your muscle cells, eventually killing all the cells. The life expectancy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy can be anywhere from 18 to 30 years old. I just knew a young man who actually survived until he was 30, but it is a very sad condition. A motor unit is a motor neuron in all the muscle cells it stimulates, and all the muscle cells in a given motor unit can contract together. The number of muscle cells in a motor unit is variable depending on where it's located. So for example, muscle cells that are responsible for very precise movements have fewer muscle cells in each motor unit than do muscles responsible for less precise units. So here is showing the spinal cord and how the spinal cord has different nerves coming off of it called motor neurons, which will attach to the muscle cells in a group. And we call this muscle group the motor unit, which involves the motor neuron and all the muscle cells that it innervates. You can see how each kind of motor neuron goes to each muscle cell individually to control it. And you can see where that neuromuscular junction is located. Increasing the number of motor units that are stimulated increases the strength of muscle contraction. This is called recruitment. Muscle twitch is contraction of a muscle in response to a single stimulus. Twitches are very brief and typically not part of normal movements, but if a second stimulus is received before the muscle is relaxed, the second twitch can be stronger than the first due to the twitches summating or being added together. Muscle twitch is a sustained, powerful contraction caused by frequent stimuli. Fatigue can set in when a muscle is unable to contract even when stimulated, and changing the frequency of stimulations is another way to vary contraction of the muscles. So this is a look at a stimulus causing a single twitch, and many stimuli in a row before the muscle can relax again would cause these twitches to summate or be added on top of each other. And if we have too many stimuli to one muscle at a time, the muscle can go into what we call tetany, where it's constantly contracted, and the stimulation ceases or fatigue will set in and the twitch will die off. Muscle contraction requires an enormous amount of energy. ATP for muscle contraction comes from many sources, typically used in sequence. So ATP will be stored in muscle cells. Creatine phosphate is stored in muscle cells, and anaerobic metabolic pathways can create ATP as well as aerobic respiration. Within 6 seconds of running a race, ATP will be stored in the muscles. Within 10 seconds, ATP is formed from creatine phosphate and ADP. During 30 to 40 seconds or at the end of exercise, ATP will be generated from glycogen stored in muscles and broken down to form glucose. Where oxygen is limited, glucose is oxidized to what we call lactic acid, and that is what causes you, lactic acid buildup causes you to feel the burn or the strain in your muscles. When oxygen is present, the heart will beat faster to deliver oxygen more quickly to your muscles. And after prolonged exercise, the oxygen debt will be paid back. So you'll breathe more heavily to get in more oxygen to those muscles that were using it in reserve stores. Slow twitch muscle cells contract slowly with great endurance. So they have abundant mitochondria, which will create the ATP necessary for them to contract with great endurance. They're packed with myoglobin, so it gives them a dark reddish appearance, and they're rich in blood supply. Fast twitch muscle cells contract rapidly, powerfully, with much less endurance. They can make and break cross bridges attachments more rapidly, and they rely on anaerobic metabolic pathways to generate ATP, and therefore tire quickly, and they're usually more lightly colored. So in your muscles, you usually have both slow twitch, which are darker, and fast twitch muscle cells, which are lighter. But depending on where these muscle cells are located in the body, you might have more of one type than the other. So again, slow twitch muscle cells are darker in color. They're packed with oxygen containing myoglobin pigment. So you'll find them in the muscles of posture, which will basically be constantly contracting to help you stand up straight. So in the abdomen, but fast twitch muscle cells you might find in your arms and legs for more quick movements that don't need to be contracted all the time. Aerobic exercise is where enough oxygen is delivered to the muscles to keep them going for long periods. It promotes the development of new blood vessels. It increases the number of mitochondria, so you're able to create more ATP. And examples of aerobic exercise are walking, jogging, and swimming. They typically do not increase the size of your muscles, though. Resistance exercise will build strength and increase muscle size. They increase the diameter of existing muscle cells. An example of a resistant exercise is weightlifting. So you should be able to, at the end of this chapter, is do these things listed here, and you can always check yourself, making sure you're prepared for exams by making sure you can do these things at the end of the chapter. And as well as this, I hope you all are doing well. Thanks for listening.